What's at stake isn't just Kyiv's security, but the possibility of Washington redrawing the red lines of the war, paving the way for secret talks that could decide the coming months of the offensive. From there, the journey involves promises of military guarantees, shadow diplomacy, and even the engineering of a face-to-face meeting between Zelensky and Putin, brokered by Trump. The key point is simple: what's hidden behind this offered protection, and what price Moscow will demand to accept this game. Zelensky did not arrive in Washington quietly. His entourage's landing was treated as an act of diplomatic warfare, and every camera at the White House entrance captured the symbol of an ally seeking survival. The Ukrainian press emphasized that the meeting with Trump was not on the agenda as a gesture of courtesy, but as the starting point of a new phase. The visit is direct and weighty because from there, not only the immediate future of the Eastern Front is decided, but also the limits of how far Washington is willing to go. For Kyiv, sitting at the Oval Office table was more than recognition. It was a chance to extract from its most powerful ally a promise that went beyond words. But the arrival itself already carried implications. For Moscow, seeing Zelensky received with official honors in the White House gardens is a message that the war will not be decided solely in the minefields of Donetsk. It's a sign that the Russian narrative of Ukraine's isolation loses traction when the image conveyed to the world is that of a Ukrainian president treated as a centerpiece of global diplomacy. The contrast is clear when comparing the scene in Washington with the previous months. While Putin was receiving leaders of allied regimes in Moscow, the White House stage placed Zelensky side by side with Trump in front of the most watched cameras on the planet. What was seen was not just diplomacy, but a clash of images. On one side, the Kremlin trying to consolidate the Russian axis. On the other, Kyiv occupying its place at the center of American power. An additional detail adds to the tension. The Kyiv press emphasized that the visit was organized in secrecy until the last moment, avoiding leaks that could compromise security. This alone reveals the degree of risk involved and reinforces the perception that every step taken on American territory had the potential to alter the logic of war. And it is precisely here that the first spark of diplomatic conflict is born. If Zelensky's arrival symbolizes strength and support, what follows promises much more than a simple official photo. Because inside the Oval Office, Trump would not just talk about solidarity, but about protection in terms that could change the course of the war. Trump left no room for doubt. According to Reuters, he directly told Zelensky that the United States would help guarantee Ukraine's security within any peace agreement. It was an immediate and visible consequence of the Ukrainian president's arrival at the White House. This promise was recorded on camera and did not sound like mere diplomatic rhetoric. It was the official commitment that Washington would cease to be merely a distant ally and become a direct guarantor of Kyiv's survival. For Ukrainians, this meant real support. For Moscow, it signaled that the war could no longer be treated as a regional conflict. But this guarantee also creates immediate risks. By tying Ukrainian security to American power, Trump transforms any future violation into a direct challenge to the United States. For Putin, the message is clear. Attacking Kyiv means testing Washington's public word. This red line heightens tension and widens the scope for conflict. The contrast with Europe is clear. While European leaders called for a truce and fragile negotiations, Trump offered solid and immediate guarantees. What was once seen as cautious diplomacy was transformed into a political military shield, and the center of the talks shifted from Brussels to Washington. And there's another detail that increases the pressure. Trump's promise was made before any ceasefire was even formally under discussion. He anticipated the situation, seizing the spotlight and forcing Kyiv to rely on the American guarantor. Moscow, in turn, was pushed into an immediate impasse. And it is at this point that the question that opens the next conflict arises. If Trump guarantees protection before demanding a truce, what will happen when he decides that a ceasefire is not a priority? Trump did not treat the ceasefire as a priority. According to Al Jazeera, even before the private meeting with Zelensky, he said he saw no immediate need to stop the fighting. This statement changed the tone of the negotiations at the White House. The position was clear. Trump offered security guarantees but did not demand an immediate truce. This gave the impression that the United States was willing to support Ukraine even in open war. For Kyiv, it sounded like room to continue resisting. The contrast with other attempts is clear. While Europe insists that a ceasefire is a minimum condition for any talks, Trump prefers to keep the pressure on. What for Brussels is the starting line is merely a tactical detail for Washington. This difference clashes with Western strategies and weakens the united diplomatic front against Moscow. And there's a detail that makes matters even worse. Trump's remarks were made in public in front of the press before entering the private meeting. In other words, it wasn't just an internal comment, but an official message that a ceasefire isn't a U.S. priority. This not only pressures Kyiv to continue the war, but also signals to Putin that negotiations will take a different pace. And this is where the next dilemma arises. If a ceasefire isn't a condition for negotiations, what will actually guide the conversation when Trump decides to call Putin? Trump left no room for doubt. He said he would call Vladimir Putin directly after the White House meetings. It was the first time he had publicly announced this intention, turning the meeting with Zelensky into an immediate trigger for Moscow. Herein lies the critical point. The call is not just a diplomatic gesture, it is a signal that Trump wants to personally take control of the negotiations. He positions himself as an intermediary between a warring ally and the United States' greatest adversary. For Kyiv, this opens the opportunity to be heard directly. For Moscow, it is an opportunity to test how far Trump is willing to go. But this move also raises alarm bells. If the American president talks about calling Putin without a ceasefire and without preconditions, this could be interpreted as a concession. For Zelensky, the promise of protection is mixed with the uncertainty of how far Washington is willing to negotiate over Ukraine. And for Moscow, the interpretation can be simple. The battlefield could be exchanged for an agreement hammered out behind closed doors. The contrast is clear. While European leaders emphasize that any talks must come after a truce, Trump announces a direct phone call to the Kremlin. What for Europe is a step back, for Washington could be a calculated move. This divergence in strategy creates noise within the Western alliance itself, and there's another detail that increases the tension. The announcement wasn't made in a confidential document, but in front of the international press, right in the White House. In other words, it wasn't just an internal message. It was a public message to Kyiv, Moscow, and the world. This puts immediate pressure on future moves and generates anticipation about what will be said in this call. And here arises the next dilemma. If Trump does call Putin, what concessions will be at stake? And to what extent will Ukraine be a pawn or a tool in this conversation? Zelensky and Trump opened the door to something unprecedented. According to AP News, the two expressed hope that trilateral talks with Putin could take place. It was the first time the possibility of a three-way meeting had been raised in public. This revelation changed the tone of the visit. It was no longer just a promise of support or an announcement of a phone call. It was a concrete opportunity for Trump to directly mediate a meeting between Kyiv and Moscow. For Ukraine, this means raising its voice to the same level as the Kremlin. For Putin, it is an opportunity to negotiate with Washington at the center of the table. But this possibility also generates a new conflict. If trilateral talks do occur, the agenda could slip out of Kyiv's control. Trump could impose terms that prioritize stability for the United States, not necessarily victory for Ukraine. And this raises the risk of Zelensky being forced to make concessions that his people may not accept. The contrast is clear. Until now, international meetings had always been bloc-based. NATO on one side, Russia on the other. Now, the idea of a three-way meeting places Trump as the arbiter and diminishes Europe's influence. The table that once encompassed Brussels and the UN may now be reduced to the Washington-Kiev-Moscow triangle. And there's another detail that heightens the tension. The hope for a trilateral meeting wasn't an external suggestion, but an announcement made inside the White House, in front of the press. This shows that it's not speculation, but a plan in the making, and the anticipation surrounding this format is putting pressure on all sides to take a stand. And here arises the next dilemma. If the three-way meeting actually takes place, who will emerge stronger? Zelensky with guarantees, Trump as mediator, or Putin imposing his own conditions? Trump was no longer just talking about phone calls. According to Bloomberg, the goal now is to organize a direct meeting between Putin and Zelensky, mediated by the United States. This is the new strategy that has changed the diplomatic landscape. The technical detail is clear. Trump has gone from being merely an ally or guarantor to positioning himself as the official organizer of a summit between the two enemies. This move means that Washington wants to be the platform for negotiations, and more than that, the central arbiter. For Kyiv, it could be a chance to look Putin in the eye under American protection. For Moscow, it could be an opportunity to negotiate with assurances that Washington is fully committed. But this move also opens up new conflicts. A direct meeting, without filters from Europe or the UN, puts Zelensky in a delicate position. Trump can impose terms that favor global stability and not necessarily Ukraine's military victory. And Putin can use the table to press for concessions that would be unthinkable in any other format. The contrast is clear. Until now, the war has been handled in blocks. NATO on one side, Russia on the other, with Europe trying to mediate. Now, Trump's proposal places everything in a closed triangle, with the Europeans left out and the table reduced to 3 chairs. What was initially a collective effort could turn into an agreement forged directly between Washington and Moscow, with Kyiv in the middle. And there's another detail that heightens the tension. Bloomberg highlights that this arrangement was presented as an ongoing plan, not just a hypothesis. In other words, it's no longer speculation. It's an active White House strategy. The expectation is that future moves will confirm this new negotiation design. And here arises the question that opens the next dilemma. If the direct meeting actually takes place, will Trump be able to impose a controlled exit, or will he simply be handing Ukraine over to Putin's pressure game? Trump ended the meeting with a direct promise. According to Al Jazeera, he assured Ukraine that the United States would provide very good protection. It was the phrase that set the tone after the meeting and ushered in the new reality of war. The statement was unambiguous. It aired live on an international live blog and demonstrated that Washington not only supports but is actively committed to ensuring Kyiv's security. For Zelensky, it confirmed that his trip to the White House was not merely a symbolic act. For Moscow, it was a warning that any military steps now would have to consider Trump's official word. But this promise also carries weight. By speaking of protection, Trump creates expectations of concrete actions that could range from expanded sanctions to indirect military operations. And this places Washington at the center of a battlefield that remains open. The promise that strengthens Kyiv could also translate into pressure on the United States. The contrast with previous months is clear. Previously, Ukraine relied on aid packages and slow negotiations with European allies. Now, American protection has been verbalized at the highest level, right in the White House. With an immediate impact on global perception, what was once fragmented support has become a political commitment, broadcast live to the world. And there's another detail that the promise was made without defining clear limits. Neither what protection means, nor how far the United States would be willing to go. This ambiguity leaves room for dangerous interpretation both in Kyiv and in Moscow. And here lies the question that clinches the narrative. If Ukraine now has the promise of American protection, what does this protection really mean? Troops, weapons, or just words? And what will be the price to be paid for it? Zelensky's visit to the White House has elevated the war to a new level, placing the United States no longer as a distant ally, but as a direct protagonist in Ukraine's future. Trump's promise of protection has redrawn the red lines and pushed Europe to the sidelines, leaving Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow at the center of the table. But the new scenario also raises uncertainty. Will this protection represent a real shield against Moscow, or will it simply be the beginning of even greater pressure and conflict?